In the aftermath of Japan's surrender in August 1945, the sprawling chemical weapons program that had played an integral, albeit covert, role during the war faced its own uncertain future. The factories, laboratories, and stockpiles, once symbols of an aggressive militaristic ambition, were abruptly left in limbo. The war had ended, but for Japan, the end of active combat signaled the start of a complex, delicate struggle to secure its post-war identity, and in that struggle, the disposal and repurposing of its chemical weapons infrastructure would become a matter of both political sensitivity and practical necessity. By the time Japan formally surrendered, it had already been one of the largest producers of chemical weapons in Asia. The Imperial Japanese Army had established more than 30 chemical weapons factories and production sites throughout its empire, including in China, Manchuria, and the Japanese home islands. These facilities were responsible for producing a range of deadly agents, mustard gas, phosgene, and the more potent and lethal nerve agents such as tabun and sarin. It's estimated that Japan produced more than 2,000 tons of chemical weapons during the war. At the time of surrender, many of these facilities were intact, their inventory largely undisturbed, awaiting an uncertain fate. Japan's decision to pursue chemical warfare had been motivated by several factors, not the least of which was the desire to counter the technological advances of its enemies. Chemical weapons were seen as a force multiplier, a means of weakening enemy morale and prolonging the conflict. However, by 1945, as the war turned decisively in favor of the Allies, the strategic value of these weapons had diminished. The shift in global attitudes towards chemical warfare, signified by the Geneva Protocol of 1925, which prohibited their use, combined with the collapse of Japan's military capabilities, meant that the extensive chemical arsenal, once a source of military pride, had become a liability. Upon Japan's surrender, the chemical weapons sites were left in a state of uncertainty. The logistical challenges of disbanding these facilities were immediate and overwhelming. There were vast quantities of chemical agents to manage, many of them unstable and hazardous. The facilities themselves, scattered across various territories, faced destruction or repurposing, depending on their location. In Japan, the priority was to dismantle military infrastructure rapidly to prevent any further use of the stockpiles. Yet, as the Japanese government was in disarray, the question of what to do with these dangerous remnants was put into the hands of the occupying Allied forces. The initial response by the Allies was one of containment and neutralization. The American forces, under the supervision of the Allied occupation authorities, took immediate steps to secure the known chemical weapon stockpiles on the home islands. Sites such as the former chemical weapons production facility at Kakagawa and the Army arsenal at Okinoto were targeted for inspection and subsequent disposal. However, the vast scale of Japan's chemical weapons program meant that no single plan could be easily implemented across all sites. The level of secrecy surrounding these facilities during the war made it difficult to fully assess the extent of the stockpiles until after the surrender. This delay in information only added to the challenges of containment. In the early stages of occupation, the Japanese government, now under the guidance of General MacArthur and the Allied forces, was tasked with locating, securing, and dismantling the chemical weapons stockpiles. However, the sheer scale of the undertaking presented significant logistical hurdles. While many chemical weapons facilities on the home islands were relatively easy to secure, Japan's overseas territories, including those in China and Southeast Asia, posed more complicated challenges. Large stockpiles remained hidden across remote locations in these regions, some buried deep underground, others stored in makeshift bunkers. For the soldiers and engineers tasked with dismantling the Japanese chemical weapons program, the dangers were immediate and real. Many of these stockpiles had been hastily abandoned, and the chemicals they contained were often poorly stored, decaying, and leaking. In some cases, Japanese military personnel, having either not been told of the war's end or not wishing to surrender, had continued to guard these facilities even after hostilities had ceased. Allied forces were forced to make use of limited intelligence, often relying on local informants and captured Japanese soldiers to locate hidden weapons depots. In the months following Japan's surrender, the focus of Allied efforts shifted towards identifying the full extent of Japan's chemical warfare capabilities. Many of the chemical weapon stockpiles were buried, often in remote or obscure locations, while others had been abandoned in hastily constructed pits. The result was a patchwork effort to dismantle the facilities, which often lacked the sophistication required for such a delicate and hazardous operation. The Allied forces, overwhelmed by the scope of the task, found themselves employing rudimentary methods of disposal. In some cases, chemical weapons were simply dumped into the sea, a practice that would later prove to be controversial due to the environmental risks it posed. The story of Japan's chemical weapons facilities, however, was not one of simple destruction. In some instances, the facilities were repurposed. Japan's post-war reconstruction efforts required enormous resources, and many former military production sites were transformed into civilian manufacturing centers. The facilities that had once been used to produce chemical agents were converted to civilian uses, including industrial chemical production, often with little regard for the toxic residues left behind. Some sites even found new roles in the agricultural industry, producing chemicals for use in farming, a fact that would later complicate the historical narrative surrounding Japan's chemical weapons program. While the Allies were busy dismantling the chemical weapons facilities on the home islands, Japan's former colonies presented a more complex issue. In territories like Manchuria, vast stockpiles of chemical weapons were left behind. These areas, now part of the Soviet-controlled zone of influence, required a different approach. The Soviet Union, which had declared war on Japan in the final days of the conflict, took its own steps to secure and dismantle the chemical weapons stockpiles in these regions. The Soviet efforts were less transparent, and reports from the time are scarce. However, it is known that many chemical weapons were discovered and destroyed in these regions, but not before they posed serious risks to both local populations and Soviet forces tasked with their disposal. By late 1945, the fate of Japan's chemical weapons infrastructure was still in flux. Some facilities had been secured and dismantled, while others had been left in disarray. The environmental consequences of these actions, or lack thereof, would only become apparent years later. Yet, even as the physical remnants of Japan's chemical warfare program were being eradicated or repurposed, the broader historical questions surrounding the program's legacy remained unanswered. The war had ended, but the fate of Japan's chemical weapons would continue to resonate for decades, as the world grappled with the consequences of this particular aspect of Japan's wartime history. As the initial efforts to neutralize and repurpose Japan's chemical weapons facilities began to wind down, the consequences of hasty and incomplete disposal became apparent. The full scope of the problem, buried in remote corners of Japan's former empire, would continue to unfold over the following decades. The initial optimism that the Allied forces had swiftly handled the dismantling of Japan's chemical warfare infrastructure soon gave way to the realization that some aspects of the program had been swept under the rug or simply too difficult to address. In Japan itself, the focus on reconstruction led to some of the more immediate concerns surrounding chemical weapon disposal being sidelined. The post-war period in Japan was one of extreme instability. Cities were in ruins, millions were homeless, and the economy was in freefall. As the occupying American forces worked to establish a new government, the immense logistical challenges of rebuilding Japan's shattered infrastructure took priority. Among these, the disposal of Japan's chemical weapons became a task relegated to the back burner in the face of more pressing issues such as food shortages, housing, and industrial rebuilding. It was not until the mid-1950s, when Japan's economy had begun to recover, that a more methodical approach to chemical weapons disposal would take shape. At first, the sites where chemical weapons had been stored were sealed off, often hastily and without sufficient long-term planning. Many were buried in the earth or dumped into the sea, as previously mentioned. The Japanese government and the occupying forces had no established protocol for dealing with these highly toxic materials in a manner that could safeguard both the local populations and the environment. In some cases, weapons were simply set alight in open-air burning pits or incinerators, a practice that proved hazardous and ineffective. The fires did not completely destroy the chemicals, leaving residues that would later seep into the soil and water, creating lingering environmental hazards. For the facilities on the Japanese mainland, the Allies' efforts largely focused on neutralizing immediate threats. The chemical weapons that were disposed of at sea or incinerated were part of a larger pattern of improvised solutions. By 1947, however, the Allies had mostly completed the task of securing and neutralizing the more immediate threats. The chemical plants themselves, which had once been integral to Japan's wartime strategy, were abandoned, many of them left as desolate industrial ruins. Some were repurposed for civilian production, but the legacy of their previous use was never fully erased. Years later, environmental surveys would uncover the toxic remnants of this period, leading to debates and investigations over the long-term impacts of Japan's wartime chemical weapons production. The immediate post-war years were marked by a lack of transparency, especially regarding the extent of Japan's chemical weapons program in its occupied territories. The challenges of dealing with these weapons were exacerbated by the confusion surrounding the political changes in Asia. While the United States focused on Japan, the Soviet Union, which had declared war on Japan in the final days of the conflict, was primarily concerned with securing the vast stockpiles left in Manchuria and other parts of northeastern Asia. These regions, now under Soviet control, became the site of a different approach to chemical weapons disposal. The Soviets, unlike the Allies in Japan, did not follow a systematic process of chemical weapons disposal. The Soviet authorities had little interest in transparency, and reports from the time are scant. What is known, however, is that the Soviet Union discovered and destroyed large quantities of chemical weapons in Manchuria and other parts of the former Japanese Empire. It is believed that, as the Soviets dismantled Japan's chemical weapons facilities in these regions, some of the agents were simply dumped into rivers, contributing to the environmental degradation of the area. In both Japan and its former occupied territories, the scope of the environmental damage caused by the disposal of chemical weapons was far from fully understood in the immediate post-war years. While efforts were made to contain and neutralize the weapons, the hasty, poorly planned disposal methods left a toxic legacy that would come to light decades later. The presence of chemical agents in soil and water systems became a concern in the 1970s and 1980s, when communities began to report mysterious illnesses and health problems linked to chemical exposure. One of the most significant challenges in addressing the long-term effects of Japan's chemical weapons program was the lack of detailed records. Japanese military personnel, who had worked on chemical weapon production and storage, were often silent on the matter. Under orders from the government, many of these individuals were instructed to keep the secrets of Japan's chemical warfare program from the public. As a result, it took years for authorities to uncover the full scale of Japan's chemical weapons stockpiles and facilities. This gap in historical knowledge further delayed efforts to address the environmental and health impacts caused by the remnants of the program. Japan's post-war chemical weapons facilities also remain the subject of occasional public controversy. In the 1990s, as the country's focus on its wartime history grew more intense, the issue of chemical weapons resurfaced. In 1997, Japan's government formally acknowledged that chemical weapons had been used during the war in China, and efforts were made to address the lingering effects of the weapons. That same year, Japan signed the Chemical Weapons Convention, CWC, which prohibited the use, production, and stockpiling of chemical weapons. This marked a significant turning point in Japan's official stance on its wartime chemical weapons program. Despite the official recognition of the problem, the ongoing efforts to locate and safely destroy Japan's remaining chemical weapon stockpiles would prove to be a difficult task. In the early 2000s, Japanese authorities undertook a series of large-scale efforts to recover and destroy chemical weapons found in former wartime sites. Notably, in 2004, Japan and China cooperated on a joint effort to clear out the chemical weapons that had been abandoned in the Chinese countryside. Thousands of chemical bombs and shells, some of which had been buried for over half a century, were recovered, neutralized, and safely disposed of. The operation was one of the largest such efforts in history, highlighting the scale of the problem that persisted long after the war had ended. Even as Japan worked to dismantle its remaining chemical weapons stockpiles, the historical narrative surrounding the issue continued to evolve. By the mid-2000s, the Japanese government had officially committed to acknowledging the environmental and health impacts of its chemical weapons program. However, many victims, especially those in China and other parts of East Asia, felt that Japan's apology for the atrocities committed during the war was insufficient. The legacy of Japan's chemical weapons program remained a contentious issue, shaped not only by the immediate aftermath of the war but also by the long-term consequences that emerged years later. Japan's chemical weapons program, though dismantled in the immediate post-war years, would cast a long shadow over the decades that followed. The facilities, once symbols of an ambitious militaristic strategy, became symbols of the enduring environmental and health consequences of wartime industrialization. The legacy of Japan's chemical warfare would not fade quickly. Instead, it would persist through environmental contamination, public health concerns, and ongoing international dialogue. Even as the world moved beyond the Second World War, the toxic remnants of that conflict would continue to influence Japan's relations with its neighbors and its own post-war identity. In conclusion, the fate of Japan's chemical weapons facilities after the war was marked by a combination of hasty actions, incomplete information, and significant long-term consequences. The initial disposal efforts, carried out by the Allies, were driven by urgency and a lack of planning, leaving behind a toxic legacy that would only become apparent in later years. The ongoing efforts to clean up and neutralize Japan's chemical weapons stockpiles continue to this day, as the world confronts the enduring legacy of these deadly weapons.